Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Pretoria, Valentine's morning. A bathroom door, locked from the inside. 4 rounds ripped through wood. On the tiles behind it lies Reeva Steenkamp. If that was fear, it carried a trigger. If it wasn't, the law had a name waiting. This is Chapter 1, and we start the same way investigators did, at the scene, with what can be seen, measured, and preserved. Silverwood's estate sits quiet before dawn on February 14, 2013. Inside a private home, the hallway from the primary bedroom leads to a small toilet cubicle, separated by a wooden interior door with a simple lock. Responders find the cubicle locked from the inside. The door shows 4 perforations consistent with 9mm rounds. Splintering is visible around the impact points. Cartridge casings are located and marked. The door is removed intact and treated as a primary exhibit. Reeva Steenkamp, model, law graduate, public figure, lies on the floor beyond that door. Efforts to breach the panel and access the space are noted in sequence. Medical response times are logged. No conclusions are drawn about motive here. The job is to hold the picture still. The home's layout is documented. Bed, corridor, threshold, cubicle, light conditions are recorded. The lock hardware and key position are photographed. Scene control includes perimeter access, the chain of custody for the door, and the capture of any immediate trace. Wood fragments, metal jacket fragments if present, wipe marks, or transfer patterns. The mention of neighbors arrives only as time anchors. Their detailed statements belong later. What matters now is the physical state of the door, the geometry of the holes, and the immediate placement of the victim. The weapon class reported, 9mm pistol, is logged. No speculation about why or how it was fired. In cases like this, precision is the only antidote to hindsight. Reeva is introduced to the record with care. She is not a headline, she is the person behind the exhibit tag. Victimology will matter later, routine, schedule, messages that are part of an evidentiary trail, but Chapter 1 refuses to wander. We do not interpret voices, we do not assign intent. We stabilize the footprint that every later test will stand on. Locked cubicle, 4 shots through wood, 1 victim on the floor. 2 explanations will survive the first 48 hours. A perceived intruder behind that door, or a domestic escalation that ended in gunfire. Both must pass the same physics. Both must pass the same timeline. As the door is carried out under seal, the investigators have one advantage every viewer should keep in mind. Wood and metal don't negotiate. They report. If you were standing at this doorway with a camera and a clipboard, what single detail would you document first? The lock position, the height of the holes, or the casing pattern on the floor? We move from the door to the person behind it. This segment establishes who Reeva Steenkamp was in ways that matter to an investigation. Verifiable background, recent routines, relevant communications, and why those details shape the 2 working hypotheses introduced earlier. The tone stays narrow and factual. No conclusions about intent are drawn here. Reeva Steenkamp was a public figure with a disciplined private life. She had a law degree, steady modeling and media work, and a growing profile on South African television. Colleagues describe her as punctual and responsive. Those traits matter because they create a baseline. When a person with that baseline stops answering, investigators do not infer motive, but they do mark the time. In major cases, routine is data. The days leading into February 14, 2013 are reconstructed from what is on record. Professional obligations, social plans connected to Valentine's week, and benign errands that place her phone, movement, and contacts inside ordinary patterns. There is no need to dramatize any of it. What matters is that her schedule was identifiable and that her communications cadence, calls, messages, confirmations, followed a stable rhythm. That rhythm stops at a specific point, and that point will later lock to the timeline you heard in the scene report. Inside the home, investigators map the spaces she would have used: sleeping area, ensuite corridor, and the small toilet cubicle separated by a simple wooden interior door. The question is not why she was there, but whether the pattern of movement is consistent with routine. A bathroom break during pre-dawn hours is not unusual. The law looks at what can be shown, not what can be imagined. The decision to lock the cubicle door becomes a pivot because it interacts with the hypotheses. If an intruder scenario is to stand, it must explain a locked from inside barrier between the person at risk and the person claiming fear. If a domestic dispute scenario is offered, it must also explain why the person at risk is separated by that same barrier. Either way, the lock is not a metaphor, it is a fact. Communications that are publicly reported, time-stamped calls or messages relevant to the evening and early morning are cataloged without embellishment. Investigators care about the clock, not tone interpretations. If a text is factual and admissible, it is used for timing. If it is subjective, it is used with caution. In high-profile cases, rumor tries to enter the record through commentary. Here, rumor is excluded. The doctrine is simple. Material either tightens the time grid or it does not. Reeva's professional footprint is noted in the record because it intersects with likelihoods. Work requires early calls, rehearsals, wardrobe pulls, and coordination. A person who must be reachable has a pattern of being reachable. When that pattern stops, we ask first where the phone was last active, not why it went quiet. When the audience hears model or public figure, it can trigger a set of assumptions. The report format strips those away. The only questions that matter at this stage are time, place, and path. Where she was, when she was last verifiably active, and which paths inside the residence are consistent with the scene found. There is space for a human sentence without abandoning discipline. The person in the photographs is the same person on the floor behind the door. The file number does not change that. But we keep that observation brief because it cannot help us choose between hypotheses. In neighborhoods like Silver Woods, violent events are rare and disruptive. People lock interior doors for privacy, habit, or caution. The presence of a lock is common. The state of the lock at a critical minute is not. As the victimology is finalized, two anchor points emerge. First, nothing in Reeva's documented routine suggests plans to leave the residence during those pre-dawn hours. Second, nothing in the public record changes the physical facts established in the scene. The door was the barrier was locked from the inside, and the shots went through that barrier. Whether someone believed there was a threat behind it will be tested by physics and timing, not by adjectives. I'll ask you what I ask trainees when they read a file like this. When a routine-oriented person stops answering and the last known location includes a locked interior door, which piece would you secure first for testing? Device logs to fix the last activity, or the locking hardware to confirm its state? We now test the claim that a stranger was inside the toilet cubicle before dawn in Pretoria on February 14, 2013. The method is the same one I teach new investigators. Isolate the environment, define possible routes, time those routes against what is already fixed, and see if the model survives contact with facts. No advocacy, only fit. Silver Woods is a gated estate with controlled entries and private homes set back from perimeter lines. An intruder model requires a workable path in and out without drawing attention. Investigators start at the estate boundary, review access control logs, and interview security about unusual activity in the hours before the shooting. If records show no unauthorized vehicle entries, we shift to pedestrian possibilities, scaling a wall or exploiting a service gap. That is possible in most neighborhoods, but possible is not the standard. We need probable under time pressure. A covert entry must align with the quiet of pre-dawn, low lighting, and the likelihood of being seen or heard crossing private yards. The exterior of the residence is surveyed for signs of approach: garden beds, gravel paths, sills, and drain pipes that capture trace without trying. Soft soil or freshly watered areas can show partial impressions even when tread patterns don't register fully. Window screens and sliders are checked for displacement, tool marks, or clean edges where dust patterns should have been disturbed. Nothing about this process assigns motive. It simply asks whether an unknown person could have been present without leaving usable disturbance. If you find none, the model isn't dead, but the burden to keep it alive increases. Next is the interior. For an intruder to occupy a small toilet cubicle, the person would have had to enter the residence, navigate quickly through private space, choose the bathroom corridor rather than a more concealed area, and close themselves into a confined room. That choice is atypical, not impossible. Burglars who believe a home is occupied will usually retreat, not hold in a box with one door and no escape. To hold, the intruder would need leverage, weapon, element of surprise, or a reason to hide specifically there. We look for indicators of rummaging or staging in living areas, missing items, or a path that suggests coercion. If the rest of the home reads undisturbed, the hide in a restroom variant carries a higher explanatory burden. Lighting matters. Investigators note whether interior lights were on or off, curtains open or shut, and whether ambient light would have assisted or hindered movement. A stranger moving in darkness risks noise and collision. In quiet hours, even a door latch can carry to a neighbor. That is why we pair environment with the emerging sound timeline, reports of bangs, shouts, or sequence fragments taken under caution. We do not argue them here. We only ask whether a hidden intruder narrative is consistent with the pattern of sounds and the absence of others. The fewer corroborating noises of entry or exit, the more the scenario leans on the assumption that a stranger was already inside well before any commotion. A difficult but not unthinkable premise. Now to the bathroom itself. A small cubicle is a funnel. One door, limited floor space, no alternate exit. If a stranger occupied it, they either believed they were undetected or they believed the door would delay discovery. The state of the lock becomes consequential because it dictates control. A locked from inside barrier implies the person within controlled the latch. A locked from outside mechanism would suggest the opposite. Here, we do not interpret mechanism detail beyond acknowledging why the lock state is central. The technical examination of hardware belongs to the forensics section later. Today we mark that any intruder theory must harmonize with a barrier controlled from the inside at the critical minute. Digital traces assist even when they are silent. Doorbell systems, estate cameras, and neighborhood motion devices can disprove as much as they prove. If the estate's perimeter shows no unknown motion, that does not rule out a stealthy person. It forces the scenario into narrower windows. Phone activity logs offer the same pressure. When the last verifiable activity on the victim's device aligns with ordinary routine, an intruder who is already inside must have entered without tripping observable markers and then chosen immobility in a bathroom. That is a very tight story to tell, but the test here is mechanical, not rhetorical. We time how long an intruder would need, where they could hide, and how their presence would affect the rest of the residents. Investigators also consult crime pattern data. Estates like Silverwoods experience opportunistic thefts, but violent hold-ins by strangers who choose interior bathrooms as refuges are rare. Rare does not mean impossible. It means we look harder for the footprints those events almost always leave. Forced points, displaced screens, unusual vehicle pauses at odd hours, or pre-survey behavior captured by earlier patrols. We collect all of that before a single inference about motive is allowed on the page. Finally, we pressure test exit. If an unknown person was in that cubicle at the time of the shooting and survived, how did they leave without help, given the attention focused on the door moments later? If they did not survive, where is the evidence of a second casualty? The model collapses or survives on practical questions like those. If you cannot show a path out, you must show a path in that ended before responders arrived. The kind of story that demands strong physical anchors, not theories. Here is what we can say at the end of this pass. An intruder scenario is not barred by physics at the property line. People climb, slip, and exploit lapses. But to reach a locked cubicle at the moment that matters, stay undetected in a house that reads largely undisturbed, and then exit unseen after gunfire and immediate attention, that is a chain with multiple links that each need weight-bearing support. In homicide work, elaborate chains do exist. They just leave marks. The next steps will judge whether those marks are present where they should be. A brief human note belongs here, measured and respectful. Families want certainty, not constructs. Testing an intruder claim thoroughly is not a dismissal of grief. It is the only fair way to keep bias out. When the conclusion comes later, it must survive this chapter. If you had access to only one new source of data to keep or kill this scenario, perimeter video or a definitive reconstruction of the lock state, which would you prioritize first, and why? Same door, new test. This segment applies equal pressure to a second explanation, that a dispute inside the home escalated before the shots. The method is standard. Fix what people heard, line it up against what devices report, and see whether the ordering supports a confrontation before gunfire or an immediate response to a perceived threat. No dramatics, just sequence. Neighbors gave statements about noises in the pre-dawn window. Some recalled an argument tone, some recalled high-pitched distress, and several tried to place the order of sounds relative to the shots. In cases like this, memory is influenced by distance, closed windows, and stress. Investigators first map each home's line of sight and sound path to the residence, then check window positions, ambient noise at that hour, and whether weather conditions might have dampened or carried sound. Those details matter because a claim of a dispute relies on the idea that voices preceded gunfire and were distinct enough to travel. The team conducts a structured sound propagation assessment, replicate likely volumes in the bedroom corridor area, measure whether a raised voice would reach the nearest receptive points, and test whether a scream within the small toilet cubicle, door closed, could project outside the primary residence at all. The goal is not to coach witness memories, but to verify whether what they report is physically plausible. Ordering is everything. If multiple witnesses report a sharp sequence, voice, pause, shots, investigators look for a common anchor, like a clock check, a phone screen glance, or a television timestamp. Even a neighbor's routine, brewing coffee, a delivery expected at a set hour, can anchor a memory to time. Each anchor is recorded with its uncertainty noted. Where accounts conflict, the report does not choose a favorite, it marks degree of confidence based on corroboration. When an account references a scream after shots, that becomes a separate marker. Post-event distress is common. Pre-event distress is harder to prove but critical if true. Digital traces help the audio. Devices inside the home, phones, tablets, any smart controllers, generate a rhythm. Even without content, metadata reveals when a device wakes, when a screen-on event occurs, or when a call is attempted. Where public record confirms time-stamped communications, those entries are placed on a single timeline and locked. The victim's last activity matters because it restricts how long any pre-gunfire exchange could have lasted. If the window is only a few minutes, an extended dispute becomes less likely. If the window is longer, the model gains room. Precision comes from triangulation. Neighbor statements, device logs, and estate security notes all aim at the same minute-by-minute frame. Investigators also weigh immediate post-event actions. Reports indicate attempts to breach the small cubicle door following the shots, calls to estate security, and medical response. Those actions are sequenced against the first audible sound neighbors described. If neighbors place a scream prior to gunfire, the breach attempts afterward should stack closely with the first outgoing calls. If neighbors place a scream after gunfire, that pattern suggests recognition and reaction rather than provocation before the shooting. None of this proves intent. It simply refines order, which later informs how the law reads risk and foreseeability. Inside the home, the team documents the corridor leading to the cubicle from the sleeping area. The purpose is to test whether an argument at ordinary speaking volume in that corridor would be audible from neighboring structures. Closed windows cut projection. In early hours, quiet neighborhoods can make small noises travel farther, but a closed wooden door on a small enclosure absorbs and reshapes sound. A scream inside that cubicle is unlikely to carry as far as the same scream in an open room. These physical constraints are written into the grid so that any witness report referencing a scream is assessed in light of likely transmission. The point is not to discredit, it is to calibrate. Digital timing can undercut or strengthen the dispute model. Consider a scenario where a device in the bedroom wakes briefly moments before shots. Screen-on events sometimes indicate someone checking the time or a notification arriving. If that happens close to the first loud report, it raises the possibility of escalation. If no such events exist and the first verifiable timestamp is a call placed after gunfire, the evidence leans toward reaction. Where messaging content, publicly reported, suggests tension in the relationship, the report notes it as context and immediately separates it from that night's sequence. Past friction may explain a dynamic. It cannot replace physics. A narrow but important check is sleep cycle probability. If a person wakes and moves to the bathroom in the pre-dawn, that movement is usually routine, not an argument trigger. A dispute model that requires loud, prolonged exchange before shots must explain why the timeline supports enough minutes for that to occur without producing additional digital or physical markers. Investigators look for such markers: a moved object, knocked items, or trail indicators in the corridor. If the rest of the space reads largely undisturbed, An extended argument compressed into that window becomes less likely. Short exchange is possible. The file must show it. The human angle belongs here, minimal and respectful. In neighborhoods like these, violent events do not just end a life. They break a sense of safety that took years to build. People do not want their homes analyzed as sound chambers. They want straight answers. The work honors that by sticking to what can be proved, who heard what, when they heard it, and whether their account aligns with what devices and logs can verify. The data aligned too cleanly in some places and not cleanly enough in others. Sometimes that is the problem. But it is also the reason we rely on triangulation instead of memory alone. As this segment closes, note what has been established and what remains open. There are statements suggesting raised voices before gunfire, others pointing to distress after. Sound testing provides boundaries for what could reach outside walls and closed windows in those minutes. Publicly reported digital entries help fix a grid. The dispute hypothesis does not collapse. It tightens. The next section, technical forensics on trajectories, casing patterns, and door behavior, will not decide motive, but it will decide what the physics allow. Then the timeline will lock the seconds. Only after that does the law take its turn. If you had to pick one element to resolve right now to strengthen or weaken a pre-shot dispute, reliable ordering of screams relative to the first shot, or a device wake just before the gunfire, which would you put first on the bench? Same door. Measure the angles. This is where speculation stops and the physical record speaks. The focus is narrow. 4 rounds through a wooden interior door, a confined toilet cubicle beyond it, and a victim found on the floor. We map bullet paths, document casing distribution, read the wood, and classify blood evidence inside the enclosure. No dramatics, no theories, just what the materials allow. The door is treated as the primary exhibit. Technicians photograph both faces under consistent light, index each perforation, and mark radial splintering. Wood fibers on the entry side flare outward. On the exit side, they feather, identifying direction of travel. That matters because it confirms that all 4 shots originated from the bedroom side corridor into the cubicle. Around each hole, concentric damage and paint disturbance indicate close to intermediate range through a barrier, not muzzle contact with wood. The pattern isn't random. Holes cluster along a vertical band that suggests the shooter aimed into a narrow target zone, typical when firing at a closed interior door where the shooter expects a person to be roughly centerline behind it. We do not infer intent from that fact. We record that the grouping is deliberate rather than erratic. Trajectory work begins with rods inserted through each perforation, extended to their terminal marks inside the cubicle. In a small room, even slight changes in angle alter strike height significantly. Rod mapping shows downward bias on select paths and straighter lines on others, consistent with a shooter outside the door firing from standing height toward a slightly lower interior target zone. The rods terminate at impact points, tile, fixtures, or wallboard, where secondary spall and trace are collected. Each path is photographed in situ, then diagrammed to scale. The goal is not to reconstruct a motive, it is to fix geometry so later testimony cannot drift. Next, casings. A semi-automatic 9mm pistol typically ejects to the right and rear, with variants from grip, stance, and surfaces. Investigators log casing locations on the bedroom side floor relative to the threshold. The distribution forms a modest arc which supports firing from the corridor rather than from inside the cubicle. If a casing lands farther than expected, that can be explained by bounce-off baseboards or furniture. Those deflections are noted and, if possible, replicated. The casing pattern does not disclose why shots were fired, but it limits where the shooter stood during the sequence. Consistency across multiple casings increases confidence in position. Inside the cubicle, bloodstain pattern analysis deals with a tight geometry. Analysts separate droplet patterns from transfer and pooling. Impact spatter tells directionality. Low-velocity pooling denotes where the victim came to rest, not necessarily exactly where they were struck. On hard surfaces, satellite stains can mislead. That is why technicians pair stain shapes with rod trajectories and strike marks to estimate body positions over time. In a room this small, a single impact can generate multiple readable features on adjacent surfaces. Critical here is restraint. Classification first, interpretation later. The presence of transfer near the door's interior face can result from post-shot contact during access attempts. That is logged without narrative. Fixtures matter. Strike marks on ceramic, a fractured panel, or a chipped edge help validate rod angles. If two independent data points, rod path and fixture damage, converge, confidence goes up. Analysts also examine whether any shot path aligns with the probable height of a person seated or standing inside. This is read against the constrained layout, the bowl, the wall clearance, and the swing of the door. Because the door was locked from the inside at the key minute, the interior is treated as a closed set. There are no alternative exits, so all ballistic energy and biological evidence must resolve within this volume unless carried out afterward. That containment is a major advantage for truth-finding. Tool marks on the door's lock area and handle are documented separately from bullet damage. Any prying, forced split, or post-shot breach attempt leaves distinctive signatures different from ballistic splintering. Technicians sequence those marks relative to gunfire by overlaying fracture patterns. If a breach attempt occurred after shots, wood failure near the latch will present differently than the clean radial halo of a bullet strike. This sequencing matters later when timing is locked. Gunfire first, then access or overlapping actions. Again, the aim is chronology, not character. Autopsy inputs, limited here to what is appropriate in this segment, anchor ballistic estimates. Wound tracks and projectile recovery correlate with rod lines through the door. If a recovered projectile's deformation matches a specific strike path or ricochet, it pairs to a perforation number. Medical findings regarding entry and exit, trajectory through tissue, and potential incapacitation timeline are used to check whether a victim could have moved after impact and for how long. This closes gaps between where physics says a body should fall and where it was found. It also informs whether post-shot screams reported by neighbors fit physiology. We do not publish graphic detail. We use the medical record to confirm or refute movement windows. Noise signatures are noted, but held to their limited purpose here. Shots through wood produce a sharp report and secondary sounds, splinters, fixture hits, and, in some cases, ricochet ping. If neighbors recalled a tight cluster of bangs, that can be consistent with rapid fire. If they recalled spacing, that can be consistent with re-aiming or hesitation. The door's perforation sequence sometimes allows ordering. Overlapping fractures show which shot came first or last, but only if damage halos intersect in a readable way. Analysts avoid overclaiming. If order cannot be resolved reliably, the report says so. By the end of this pass, we have 4 hard outputs. First, all shots traveled from the corridor into the cubicle. None originated inside. Second, the grouping and angles indicate purposeful aim into a limited human height zone through a barrier. Third, casing arcs support an exterior firing position. Fourth, interior bloodstain classification and strike mapping define likely positions and movement after impact. These findings do not decide motive. They set the physical boundaries that any explanation, intruder fear, or dispute escalation must inhabit. If a story asked you to believe the impossible about wood, brass, and gravity, it is the story that moves, not the physics. A brief human line belongs here. The point of rigorous forensics is not to strip a person of their story, it is to ensure that the story we accept can carry the weight of evidence. Families deserve conclusions that survive measurement. If you could add one more data point to tighten this even further, high-resolution sequencing of the 4 shots from acoustic analysis or lab confirmation tying a recovered projectile to a specific door perforation, which would you request first? Same door. Lock the seconds. This segment consolidates what happened from the first audible disturbance to the arrival of help, using only anchored times, device logs, estate security records, neighbor statements with corroborated references, and the sequence of post-shot actions. The aim is to remove guesswork. Order comes before opinion. Investigators start with what can be time-stamped. Publicly reported entries place routine activity in the evening prior and normal communications cadence into the late hours. The pre-dawn window on February 14, 2013 is then isolated. Any verifiable device wakes, screen-on events, or call attempts inside the residence are pinned to a single grid. Each item is marked certain, system time or server time, or estimated human memory with an anchor such as a TV clock, alarm, or habitual task. Nothing in this grid interprets motive, it only positions events. Next, audible reports from neighbors are normalized. Each account is mapped to distance, building orientation, and window state documented earlier, where a neighbor notes voice, pause, shots, and can tie that to a clock glance or a daily routine start. The entry is logged with its confidence level. Where another places a scream after gunfire, that goes in a separate row. Conflicts are not averaged, they are displayed side by side. This prevents compression, an error that turns multiple moments into one. Per the forensic chapter, the door is known to have 4 perforations from the corridor into the locked cubicle. That fact constrains timing. The sequence immediately after gunfire includes an attempt to breach the door and calls to estate/security for help. Those actions are placed against the first logged outreach. If the first successful contact occurs within a tight interval after the last shot, then any extended pre-shot exchange becomes less likely. If the gap is longer, the window for a confrontation expands. Either way, the clock, not commentary, sets the frame. Responders provide additional anchors. Dispatch intake produces a recorded time. Estate security logs record contact and movement. Medical arrival and handover are logged again. These entries are often more reliable than recollection because they are system-generated. The grid uses them as hard posts and hangs the human accounts between them. A clean grid will show a narrow band between final shot, breach effort, and the first verified call. A wider band would demand extra explanation, either missed attempts or a delay for reasons the file must document, not assume. Inside the house, movement within the corridor is inferred only where the timeline permits. If a device inside the bedroom wakes just before the first loud report, it narrows the start of the critical minute. If there is no such wake, and the earliest timestamp is the outgoing call after the shooting, the narrative must align with immediate reaction rather than a prolonged exchange. This is the difference between speculation and sequence. One human line belongs here. Order is a form of respect to the person who died and to the people asked to believe what happened next. When we lock the minutes, we protect them from opinion drift. If you had to strengthen this grid with a single addition, would you choose a verified device wake inside the residence within 1 minute of the first loud report, or an independent estate log confirming the precise moment of first contact from the home? Same facts, new legal reading. When this case entered a Pretoria courtroom in 2014, the question was not whether Reeva Steenkamp died behind a locked toilet cubicle after 4 shots were fired through the wooden door. That was fixed. The question was how the law should classify the shooter's state of mind when he pulled the trigger. The prosecution leaned on the record you already know: 4 9mm rounds fired from the corridor into a small locked enclosure, a victim found on the floor beyond that barrier, and the physical mapping that showed purposeful lines of fire into a human height zone. They paired that with witness accounts about noises in the pre-dawn window and with message timing that, in their view, gave context to a dispute. Their position was straightforward. A reasonable person foresees a fatal outcome when firing multiple rounds through a door into a space where a person is likely to be. To the state, the physics itself spoke to unlawful intent. The defense advanced a different frame: a perceived intruder, a rapid threat assessment in the dark, and firing through the door as a defensive response. They emphasized disability, context, and fear, arguing that the shots were the product of mistaken belief rather than hostility toward the person behind the door. Where the state pointed to grouping and trajectory as proof of targeting, the defense called them the natural result of aiming center mass at an unknown threat position. Where the state cited screams, the defense challenged ordering and audibility. Both sides used the same seconds. They gave those seconds different meanings. Trials turn on definitions. The judge separated negligence from intention and applied South African law to the sequence. On the evidence before the court at that time, the ruling found that the state had not proved intent to kill beyond a reasonable doubt. The conduct was still unlawful and grossly negligent, firing through a closed, locked door into an occupied space without confirming who was inside. The legal name for that conclusion was culpable homicide, a negligent killing. Sentence: 5 years. Additional penalties for firearm counts were addressed separately, but the headline result was clear: no murder conviction at this stage. From an investigative standpoint, this is where restraint matters. The measurement work, angles, casing arcs, blood classification, and the locked door timeline was not rejected. It was read through a negligence lens rather than an intent lens. The court acknowledged serious risk-taking conduct. It did not attach the murder label to that conduct in 2014. For families and communities, that distinction can feel technical. In court, it is everything. One human line belongs here. Legal language is careful because it has to be. When a judgment names conduct as negligent rather than intentional, it is not minimizing the loss. It is locating the conduct within the law's map. The map can change on appeal. But at this stage, the finding was set. Culpable homicide, 5 years. As you think about the same seconds we have tracked across this series, ask yourself this. If you accept the forensics as fixed, is the difference between negligence and intent found in physics or in what a person says they believed when they fired? Same facts. Final name. South Africa's Supreme Court of Appeal reviewed the fixed record. A locked toilet cubicle in Pretoria, 4 9mm rounds fired through the wooden door, a victim found behind that barrier, and a minute-by-minute sequence anchored by calls and response logs. The court asked a narrow legal question. When someone fires multiple shots through a closed, occupied space, what state of mind does the law attach to that decision? Under South African doctrine, dolus eventualis answers it. If death is a foreseeable outcome and the shooter proceeds regardless, the act is murder. On that basis, the appellate court reclassified the 2013 killing of Reeva Steenkamp as murder. The case returned for sentencing. 6 years in 2016, later increased in November 2017 to 13 years and 5 months to reflect the gravity recognized on appeal. Nothing about the science changed. The law's reading of accepted risk did. The forensics and the timeline remained the spine. The label moved from negligent killing to intentional under dolus eventualis. Punishment then shifted from custody to supervision under South Africa's corrections system. Parole was granted on January 5, 2024. It did not erase the conviction or the term. It moved the remaining years to community corrections with conditions, restricted movement, mandated programs addressing violence and accountability, and regular reporting. Under the final orders, supervision continues through December 2029. Until then, compliance is not optional. It is the sentence served outside a cell. It's right to state the ending once, clearly, and leave it there. Final status: murder conviction under dolus eventualis. Sentence 13 years 5 months. Parole active from Jan 5, 2024. Supervision through DEC 2029. That is the legal truth of this file. A closing human note, brief and necessary. The system's precision, the door measurements, the timing grid, the doctrine, exists for one reason: to ensure conclusions can carry the weight of a life taken. Reeva Steenkamp was not a case number. She was a person whose future ended on a bathroom floor because rounds were sent through what could not be seen. The most useful lesson is plain. Certainty about a threat is not optional when the tool in your hand is lethal. Behind every exhibit tag is a family that has to live with what you chose. If your community could change one thing after this case, clearer public teaching on legal standards like dolus eventualis or more transparent reporting on parole conditions, which would make outcomes easier to understand and why. I've walked you through inches, seconds, and law because clarity saves lives. My takeaway is simple. Don't act on fear you haven't confirmed, and don't ignore risk you clearly see. Accountability isn't vengeance. It's how a community stays safe and how a family gets truth. Learn how your laws work, check on people you love, and treat closed doors, literal or not, with caution and respect. If this resonated or challenged you, subscribe to the channel, drop where you're watching from, and tell me what you'd change. More legal explainers, survivor resources, or something else. If it didn't land, say why. Let's keep the conversation honest.